the number of Indians in the United States runs into a few thousands at most, right? But if you're speaking about immigrants coming from Scandinavia, from Germany, or much later on, let's say from Italy, well, there you're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions, in some cases, right? So the real comparison there with respect to the question of acquisition of political power would involve making a comparison between immigrant communities from, let's say, Western Europe and the Indians in the 1980s, by which time there's a sufficient number of them.
Sure.
There's a sufficient number of them. Then we could make a comparison of sorts. Okay? But before we get to that comparison, so let's pause for a moment to take a look at a figure such as Sound. Okay, so now he's an Indian who runs for Congress in 1956, wins 3 two-year terms, and one has to try to figure out exactly how it is that he was able to triumph at that moment. Because recall, 1956, Indians are still really, effectively speaking, barred from the United States. I mean, it's a highly ironical situation. On the one hand, you have an Indian who's running for the House of Representatives and actually wins, right? And was, for dog's years, the only Indian American who ever served in the Congress, right? Until very, very recent years, right? But he's doing all of this at a time when Indians are effectively barred from the U.S. So I think this is a very ironical situation, and then it also poses a puzzle as to how he was able to achieve that success. And my suspicion is that he was able to do it precisely because the Indian community was so small, numerically so insignificant, that the question of he representing a community that could then in turn be viewed as a threat simply didn't arise. So this is an interesting situation, because here we are saying there was an advantage with respect to getting elected. There was an advantage in small numbers. Now this is completely counterintuitive, because most people would assume that in order to make yourself politically, heard, you would have to have numbers behind you. You'd have to belong to a community that's sufficiently large, right? Now then you look at the Indian community in the 1980s, because by the 1980s now you're talking about communities that's much stronger. There are various ways of assessing their influence. For example, the manner in which Indians were able to build what I would describe as large, in some cases ostentatious temples, right? By the 1980s, this is starting to become possible. This can only become possible if a community is large enough, affluent enough, right, and has a luxury to engage in such kinds of activities. But you don't really find them in the political domain at this point in time. You don't find Indians really in the political domain, right? So one would have to understand why they may have been absent from it. And I think that there are lots of reasons for that, some of which I've discussed in my book, some of which I haven't at all, because it would require a very lengthy discussion to get into it. But I'll give you illustrations of, give you a sense of why I think the Indians may not have been politically very active throughout the 1980s and 1990s. I think the situation is now changing. But for that period of time, one consideration is that these are Indians who are all people who have come from India. So this is not your second generation of Indian Americans born here. These are professionals who came to the U.S. in the wake of the reforms of 1965. And essentially you've got graduate students, so many of them are coming as graduate students in the sciences, in engineering, a few in medicine later on. That those numbers will increase. They have come from a country where the dominant ideology, at least officially, was that of secularism. So this was Jawaharlal Nehru's India. Jawaharlal Nehru died in 1964. The INS reforms are 1965, right? And when they come to the U.S., they come with the idea, number one, which is an idea that you find in middle-class communities in many parts of the world, that politics is really dirty, if I may put it this way. It's for people who are not, for the most part, decent, and it's for people who don't have the correct aspirations for their children. This was a widely prevalent feeling. I suspect it's still a widely prevalent feeling. I think that if you go to many middle class households all over the world, they'll tell you, well, it's a dirty thing, And I don't think, by the way, that the ascendancy of somebody like Obama is going to necessarily change that perspective, right? So that was one reason. Second was that, I think that they have an understanding, which is an absolutely correct understanding, that before you can seek to enter into politics, before you have any remote chance of winning, you have to have roots in the local community, in the country where you have come. Now, if you've just come here, you can't enter into politics straight away. It's going to take you at least a generation, which in effect is what's happened, if you think about it. I mean, lots of Indians here, Indian Americans, have this anguished sense that we haven't been involved in politics, we're an invisible minority. I've heard that phrase countless number of times. But that's nothing unnatural about it. That you've been here essentially for the last 4 decades, right? It takes a generation to put down roots, to get established. In fact, I would say that if you look at the history of immigration to the United States, typically it takes 2 generations to really put down roots in a firm way and get established. So the Indians, in that sense, haven't done badly. Of course, the 2 generations it took back in the late 1800s, those were different times. Right, and the opportunities for advancement in different domains have obviously quadrupled, multiplied enormously, in the course of the last 100 years, right? But for the community to have taken a generation to find its feet and then to insert itself into the political domain is not unusual. But the story is much more complex than what I've indicated so far, because think of it this way. I mean, India, the economic reforms in India began in 1991, essentially. The dominant image of India in the West, in the United States before 1991, was of a huge country that's in a state of slumber. Okay. In fact, economists had a special phrase for India. India was suffering through what was called the Hindu rate of growth. In fact, there were more children than there was increase in GNP, if I may put it this way. And the idea was that, all right, so this is a great ancient civilization. I mean, that's how Indian Americans thought of India as well. But the fact of the matter is that you could be a great ancient civilization, but nobody pays any attention to you now. That was the situation of India throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s. Right? That's what we're talking about. Now, I think that there is an awareness among the Indian Americans here that you can't really be pushing to insert yourself. You can't, for example, what is your relationship to the country back home, right? There's always a relationship between political groups of immigrants here and the country back home. Sometimes it's very overt, as in the case of the Irish. We know that the Irish Republican tradition, Irish revolutionary ambitions were fueled not only by people living back in Ireland, but much more so by members of the Irish diaspora in the United States, right? So as long as India remained in the backyard, so to speak, I think Indian Americans understood that they also had to remain in the background. So it is not an accident at all that the political aspirations of the Indian American community, began to become visible, right? At the same time that India now starts to become more visible on the world scene. Not as a civilization, which it had always had a place there, but as a kind of a nation state, with some muscle power, some economic strength, right? That is what India was not. And the Indian Americans understood that, and once the economic reform started in India, and by the mid-1990s, it was clear that India was now something of an emerging power, that at least you had to think about India with respect to the global economy, something that you never had to, frankly, for the last 3-4 decades. A very discomforting fact for Indian Americans, a very humbling fact that you've got this huge country of 1 billion people, well, what is now 1 billion plus, and as a friend of mine once said, so I don't take any credit for this particular quotation, but this friend of mine once described India as the largest, most unimportant country in the world, for a very long period of time, right? So that begins to alter in the 1990s, and I think you will begin to see that the Indian American community here will then began to slowly make inroads into politics.
So going back to Sando, what do you have any indication of what his fundraising was like at that time? Any legislation that he might have tried to pass?
Not really, because I haven't really done a detailed study of. I mean, I've read about him. He actually has an autobiography. I read portions of it, but I couldn't say whether he was really a force in the House. My sense of it is that he was not, because I've read widely into American history of that period. So and you have to remember what the 50s is also the period of not just the Cold War, of course, but the Red Scare. Okay, the Red Scare. So the whole phobia about communism, all of that. And my sense of it, at least from the histories I've read of that period, is I don't see his name surfacing anywhere at all. You only see his name surfacing, obviously, in accounts of the Indian diaspora, or if somebody's written a history of Indians in the U.S., then his name will surface. But I'm not certain. But I don't want to be decisive about this, because I haven't really read enough about him, and I think somebody would have to go and do research on the Sound papers. There must be, I don't know which library owns his papers, but the 6 years he spent in the House, they must have generated a whole body of paperwork.
So what do you see as the future? Is it still, as you may have indicated, tied to India's progress? Let's say India hits a big slump. Are we going to see a dearth?
Well, not necessarily, because I think that now the community here has a greater degree of self-confidence. In other words, that you see, once you've made certain inroads, to some extent you are not tied entirely to the history of what's happening in India itself. So let's take the scenario that you have raised. The scenario being, well, what if India runs into a few roadblocks? What if the rate of growth really goes crashing down? Okay, it's going to go substantially down anyhow. It cannot be 8 or 10%. And in fact, now India's projecting 6% for the coming year. The World Bank is saying it's going to be more like 4.5%. Whatever the exact figure, let's say 5%, 4%. The point here is that if that scenario comes true, that India runs into roadblocks, so is that going to have any consequences for the Indian American community, right? And there are multiple ways of looking at. Well, there may be consequences, and there is a connection there. We know that India would like foreign direct investment. Indian Americans are obviously one of the most affluent constituency, which can contribute to investments in India, right? But politically, that is, that would there be consequences for the community politically? Would it lead to an erosion of political aspirations among Indian Americans? My feeling is not, no, because I think that the Indian American community here now has grown in substantial numbers. It's not quite yet 1% of the population of the United States, but the community registers very rapid growth, much faster growth than for most other immigrant communities. It's highly affluent down to the present day, which is not to say that there are no pockets of Indian Americans who are poor. I think that's the side of the story we don't know much about for the most part. But on the average, levels of affluence are very high. Indians are well placed as professionals across all spheres of life, right? And then you have the phenomenon of people like Bobby Jindal. Now, whether he should be a model or not is a question that we can discuss at some length if we wanted to. But the fact of the matter is that the Indian American community could claim him as one of their own if they wanted to. I'm saying could because Jindal has never really claimed any allegiance to the community, frankly. I think that has to be understood. His parents actually are much better known in the Indian American community than he himself is known. And here I'm not even referring to, such things as his conversion to Christianity and all of that. Because you can be a member of an Indian American community and not be a Hindu, for example. But I think the question here has to do with whether he has any sense of any kind of feeling for India, and my sense is, frankly, very little, which is not to say that he may not want to bank upon the community for some kind of electoral program at some point in the future. That he may expect or hope that a greater part of the constituency of Indian Americans will vote for him. Let's suppose he was running for national office, right? He might expect or hope for that outcome. So he wouldn't be indifferent at that point to the fact that he's an Indian American. But I think if you look at his politics over the course of the last 10 years, the course of his life, there's very little to suggest that he has any feeling for either India or for the Indian American community at all.
Go ahead. I just have two questions, and then you could take over. So what about Indian Americans or South Asians and other Asian groups in Southern California? Has your research brought you across examples of really good cooperation, or any instances of infighting?
There's plenty of infighting. I mean, there's this parade that used to be done, and I'm sure still is done, on August 15th. The anniversary of Indian independence, and there have been years, and you can follow that debate in the pages of India West in particular. So there have been years in the 1990s when the parade ran into serious trouble because different organizations were claiming to represent the Indian community. Okay, and usually when they give out a permit, they give it out to one organization, for example. So there was claims by contending groups that each of them was much more representative. That sort of thing has happened very frequently, and if I dug through my files, I could give you precise references to some of these debates.
I'm familiar.
You're probably familiar with some of that. Okay, so you do have infighting of that kind, but Southern California would have to be distinguished from Northern California, partly because I think in Northern California the political groups, particularly the more left of center groups, are much better organized. Southern California hardly has any to begin with, frankly. I mean, what you have here is you have groups that represent the Indian community or claim to represent as a whole. But if you're looking for, let's say, group of progressive South Asians or Indians, they're very few. I mean, I've been involved in that sort of enterprise for a while, so I know that quite well.
How much of what South Asian candidates or Indian candidates do with regard to politics is really aimed at the mother country or the home country, in regards to maybe improving relations between the U.S. and India?
Yeah, I mean that would be the principal area of interest with respect to how much activity a politician is engaged in, with an eye to what's happening in India, right? But that's more at the national level, frankly. I mean, if you're running for running